Hello and welcome to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Yankee, live after Sunday where we had 13 games of football. And it was a very busy day. Basically, every team in the league either has new running backs, new wide receivers, new tight ends, or new offensive play caller. So it was a lot to go over. It was probably the longest recap I've ever had, but we will go over the top couple recaps here tonight, actually, before I get to my waiver articles, but we will start with the Detroit Lions, or not the Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions just won against the Los Angeles Rams, but we will start with the Cincinnati Bengals. They were the one running back situation where we really did not know what to expect heading into things. We knew that Zach Moss throughout the preseason was expected to be the primary running back for Cincinnati, but then Chase Brown was the one to get all of the hype throughout the preseason because he was doing well in training camp. He was the one playing with the starters, but we did see a backfield where Zach Moss was the primary guy. He was the primary guy, not just in early downs. He took the goal line snap. He took the short yarded situations, third down, 2-minute drill. This was mostly his backfield. We did see Chase Brown play a decent amount on early downs, which was pretty good to see, but this was something where Zach Moss is probably going to be the main guy going forward. We might see a little bit of Chase Brown. I would still keep Chase Brown on your roster in most leagues. Some shallow leagues, I would be okay dropping Chase Brown at this point, but I'm more comfortable starting Zach Moss. Will really depend on the Bengals in general. If the offense starts playing better, that'll be very important for Moss in general, because the big thing with him is he needs to score those touchdowns, which is what Joe Mixon was doing with the Bengals in the past. So if the Bengals offense starts playing better, then Moss is probably a fantasy starter going forward. Next backfield I want to get to is the Jacksonville Jaguars, and this is one where it was a little surprising. We saw Tank Bigsby play a decent amount on offense. He was the better running back of the two in terms of rushing yards in this game. Set a career high with 73 rushing yards, where ETN only ran for 44 yards, both of them running the ball 12 times. So a little bit surprising to see Bigsby play this much. Really, in terms of Travis Etienne, this is a pretty similar snap count to what he was seeing at the end of last year. We saw the first half of the year he was pretty consistently playing 80% of snaps, over 80% of snaps, but the second half of the year they really started toning down how much he was on the field. It was typically a little under 70% of snaps, and that's exactly where ETN was this week. The big difference this time around is last week it was Dearness Johnson as well as Tank Bigsby kind of splitting those backup snaps. This week it was entirely Bigsby, and whenever ETN was off the field before, it was typically a pass play, where this week, whenever he was off the field, a lot of times it was a run play. So I'm still probably starting ETN in most of my leagues at this point, but it is a little concerning that Bigsby was seeing so much playing time. Started figuring out who I'm considering for the waiver wire article, and Bigsby is one of the top running backs I'm considering off the waivers this week, just because if he continues to play this many snaps, the big thing is last year he was considered a short yardage back, considered a goal line back, and he could take those goal line snaps from ETN going forward. ETN got that goal line snap in this game, which was good for ETN and good for anyone who started ETN, but that's no guarantee that he will continue being the short yardage back. So if Bigsby starts taking those snaps, that could be pretty huge for his fantasy production, and then maybe get to a situation where both running backs could be potentially viable in fantasy leagues. So after Jacksonville, probably the next biggest surprise situation for me, at least, was the Chargers, where we saw this be a two-man backfield where J.K. Dobbins was the primary guy in third downs and short yardage, and also taking half of the early down work. He really put up the best numbers of the running backs in this game, which was huge for him, not just for his fantasy production, but just considering everything that he has gone through over these past couple of years in terms of all of the injuries. So this is a situation where Dobbins very well could be in fantasy starting lineups as soon as next week. He had a huge 61-yard run. He had a 12-yard run that went for a touchdown. His average yards per carry was much better than Gus Edwards because of those long runs, but it's a situation where Edwards, we thought he'd have a higher percentage of early down work heading into this game. We thought he'd have more of those short yarded situations prior to this game. So it's basically the same role he had in Baltimore, where he was playing a decent amount of early down work, and that's it, but not a very high percentage that could make him a fantasy starter. And he was never a fantasy starter in Baltimore on any consistent basis, and the Chargers don't have as good of an offensive line. So Edwards is someone that in some leagues I'm considering dropping him for some of these other running backs, since I don't really see a path for him to be a fantasy starter if J.K. Dobbins is going to play this well. And that's also considering Vidal, who was a healthy and active for this game, and we think he's going to get involved at least a little bit in the backfield at some point this season. So Dobbins, someone I'm a bit more excited about. I know he's still available in at least some leagues. The vast majority of leagues he is on rosters right now, and probably the leagues that you're in, he'll be on a roster, but it is at least worth checking if he is on the waiver wire, because on the off chance he is, then he is probably the best running back that you could take at this point in time. One more running back situation that I want to dig deeper into, and that's the Minnesota Vikings. This is probably the other one that surprised me the most. A lot of the things that I'm including in my top 10 recap are basically what surprised me this week, even though there were a lot of things to cover over a lot of positions. But with the Vikings, we saw a lot of rotation in this one. Ty Chandler played a bit more than I expected him to play. It was a bit of a rotation by drive in this game. Jones saw the vast majority of snaps on 6 of the 10 drives. Chandler saw the majority of snaps on the other 4 drives. So this left Jones playing the important roles and goal line, short yardage situations, as well as the 2-minute drill, which was good to see. There were some snaps where there was no halfback on the field. They last year were using CJ Ham in some passing situations, so that looks like it's continuing this year. But Aaron Jones, I kind of expected him to see a little bit more of a majority of snaps. I know he's on the older side for a running back, but his fantasy value was still very good in this game. He was an effective runner, averaged 6.7 yards per carry. So good for Jones in general, but I would like to see a higher percentage of snaps for him. So he's still probably in most fantasy starting lineups going forward, and I could see a situation where the Vikings are losing games and he might play more in those general passing situations. But if anything, I'm a little lower on Jones now than I was coming into this game. So that'll cover it for the running backs that I want to go through. If you go to my fantasy football recap, which is up on pff.com right now, I cover basically every running back situation that we had today. So all 26 backfields. There were a number of running backs as well who either saw career highs in snaps or carries, and I'm higher on now than I was to start the season. So a number of running backs who I'm pretty excited after this week, as well as some other situations where we saw some stuff go on in the preseason. For example, the Raiders situation, and we saw that continue to play out. So if you want to know more about some of these running back situations that I'm not covering here, you can definitely read about it in the recap. I do have a couple questions here, one of them asking about Bucky Irving, so I'll go ahead and go through that, even though I don't have the slide here. Irving played a decent amount on early downs as well, pretty similar to the Jacksonville situation, where Rashid White was the clear early down running back, took all of the passing down work, but Irving played very well in his limited snaps. Led the team in rushing yards, so I would not be at all surprised if Irving takes a bigger jump in terms of how many rushing opportunities he sees going forward. He's someone where off the waiver wire, probably one of my top ads this week. Julio McLaughlin in Denver, probably the other one, joining Irving and Tank Bigsby as the big 3. It'll be another situation where Irving can overtake White in terms of goal line situations. That'll be huge for his fantasy production, because then he would be the one scoring the touchdowns. And then there's a chance he could be fantasy viable even if White doesn't suffer an injury. But White, someone that I talked about in my 5 players to avoid this year because of that lack of production in the rushing game. And we blamed a lot of it on the offensive line. But even last year, when there were perfectly blocked plays, White still wasn't gaining as many yards as you would expect a running back to get. And now with Irving playing so well with the exact same offensive line, it's showing that the Buccaneers can probably get better production in the run game with a different running back. So I don't expect White to be losing snaps on passing downs. He was still a very effective receiving back. He showed that again today. And then another question briefly, Blake Corum, the Rams tonight, it was a bit surprising to see him not play at all on offense. The Rams basically rested everyone all preseason who we knew were going to make the roster. So we just kind of assumed Corum was going to be the number 2 running back. It was really Rivers who was the second running back, took a couple of snaps in this game. So it was surprising to me since Corum had been talked up. I would still hold on to Corum. I would not be at all surprised if in the coming weeks Corum becomes the number 2 running back, and especially if something happens to Williams. And it was also just generally surprising that Williams had as many offensive snaps as they did. They talked about wanting to limit his work this season, but they still kept him on the field for the vast majority of plays throughout the game. So ideally, we see Corum get at least a couple of snaps going forward, but I would still hold on to him for now. Next, wide receivers in general, there were a couple of situations that changed throughout the season, some that I am high on, some that I'm low on. Cover all of that in the article, but the last big takeaway that I want to get into is at tight end, and that is with Dalton Kincaid. We saw Kincaid play the most amount of snaps that he has in a game that Dawson Knox also played, which was huge for him. He played over 80% of snaps twice last season, both in games where Knox didn't play, but Kincaid saw those snaps that we were hoping that he would get. There were a couple of snaps or a couple of times early in the game where it was Dawson Knox in 11 personnel on a passing play where Kincaid was not on the field. So a little disappointing not to see Kincaid in some of those situations, but especially down the stretch in the second half of the game, Kincaid took the vast majority of snaps in 11 personnel and 12 personnel. So Kincaid, even though we didn't see the targets this week, didn't see the receptions this week that we would have hoped to see, it was promising to see him get that playing time over Knox so that in the future he can get those targets. So it's one step in the right direction, even though he didn't quite get as much work as we hoped for. So it was good to see for Kincaid. It was a similar thing with Kyle Pitts this week, playing nearly 100% of snaps. It was the most snaps that he's seen in a very long time. So he scored the touchdown, didn't quite get as many targets as we hope, but at least he helped fantasy managers with that touchdown in a week that there weren't many good weeks out of tight ends. A lot of tight end situations where it was a rotation of guys. Jonnu Smith in the preseason only played in 11 personnel. A similar thing happened this week. Cole Kmet, who I've talked about a number of times, was again the number 2 tight end in terms of pass routes. I do have a question about tight ends to target on the waiver wire this week. Obviously, the big one out of Baltimore. I'm blanking on the name because I keep going through too many players in my head. Isaiah Likely. So Likely definitely had by far the best week out of tight ends, and could very well see more playing time going forward. The fact that they played so much in 12 personnel was very encouraging out of Baltimore, and I expect that to continue going forward, so much out of 12 personnel. So the fact that he was basically the only tight end this week to do any good, he's probably my top target. Outside of him, Taysom Hill's still available. I know he didn't have the best week this week, but he was still decently involved in the offense, so I would be fine still picking up Hill in the couple of leagues that he's still available. Outside of that, 3 guys that I'm probably looking at: Colby Parkinson for the Rams in the game last night, or tonight. Now it's almost tomorrow. We're 3 minutes away from it on the East Coast, but Parkinson played the vast majority of snaps for the Rams at tight end. It was only a couple snaps he took off. It was basically the same role that Tyler Higbee had, but ideally Parkinson is a little bit better of a tight end than what Higbee was. So Parkinson's probably the top guy that I am targeting outside of Likely. If you don't want to bid as much for Likely, Parkinson available in 98.5% of ESPN leagues. So he's probably my top target. I think 3rd most receiving yards for a tight end this week so far as well, which was huge for him. Outside of that, definitely monitoring the David Njoku injury situation. Suffered ankle injury, I believe it was in a walking boot. at the end of the game, so it sounds like things might not be good for him. So Jordan Akins was the replacement for him. Atkins played basically every snap the rest of the game, which was good to see. Had the second most receiving yards on the team. And if you look at his PFF grade from 2020 to 2023, 71.7 receiving grade, which isn't excellent, but it is above average for a tight end. So when you mix an above average tight end in an offense where you're seeing almost every snap, that's generally a good situation for success, and I don't see a lot of people necessarily targeting him compared to some of the other tight ends that are out there. So he's probably more of an under the radar guy that I'd like this week. And then one more question about the Raiders offense. The Raiders, since I like paying a lot of attention to the snap counts and writing the recap article, I didn't get to see too much of how well the players played. I was promising to see Brock Bowers get as much work as he did. Second most receiving yards for a tight end this week. Didn't see quite as much two tight end sets as I would have liked to see, but I think it was only about 25% of the time where it was both Bowers and Mayer on the field. And then in 11 personnel, it was a bit of a mix. Bowers played a little bit more than Mayer, but Bowers, whenever he was on the field, it was almost a clear sign that it was going to be a passing play. Whenever Mayer was on the field, it was a mix of run versus pass. So expecting good things out of Bowers this season. I think the injury may have held back how many snaps he played, but if he continues playing the snaps that he did today, he's still probably a top 10 fantasy tight end this year. It'll just be if he can see even more snaps than he played in this game, he has the potential to be top 5. But running backs went about as I expected. Zamir White taking the first 2 drives, Alexander Mattison taking the third drive, taking more playing time on early downs throughout the game, taking all of the third downs, taking the 2-minute drill. So it's what I expected out of White. He ran the ball 13 times, 44 yards. Ideally would have had a little bit higher yards per carry, but not really too much involved in the passing game. And this was a game where Amir Abdullah did not see an offensive snap. Derek Laube healthy and active. So I think things will be very different if the Raiders are favored to win the game. Then White can play a lot more on early downs, keep running the ball throughout the game. So if you have White, I wouldn't drop him, but there will probably be a couple of weeks where you can start him if the Raiders are going to be a bit closer in the game. But if the Raiders are losing games like this all the time, then White might not have that much fantasy value. And especially considering Madison averaged more yards per carry, it's possible they want to try someone else if this continues. So not too excited about White. In deeper leagues, I'd be fine with Madison as a waiver wire ad, but that'll probably mostly cover it for me, since I have to get to the waiver wire article to make sure that it is up for Monday morning for everyone. Probably have about 30 to 35 waiver wire targets to go through. Luckily, a lot of the players that are on the waiver wire list are players that you could kind of anticipated ahead of time. There weren't too many huge surprises of a name coming out of nowhere. Like even Tank Bigsby was someone that was on my sleeper list heading into the week. A lot of the guys that were on my sleepers throughout the offseason, Brandon Cook's another one, scored a touchdown for Dallas, who's probably going to be one of the top wide receiver targets this week. So I will be back with John on Tuesday to go over the waiver wires, the exact same schedule we had with that last season, where we'll be on Tuesday mornings going over the waivers. Then John will be recording a IDP piece like he has been doing. And then John and Nick Bodiford will be on Thursdays going forward doing start sit heading into week 2, since we're getting close to finishing week 1 already, which was a fairly crazy week 1. But thank you for everyone for listening today. Thank you for everyone for reading the recap article, probably the longest recap article that I have written. But if you go there and want to see more about the stats of the players as well, since I go through a lot of the usage, which situations players were used for, but if you want to see more about the grades for the players and everything like that, grades will be released tomorrow. And if you get a PFF Plus subscription, you'll get access to all the grades, all the stats, all the things that I do not cover in the article. So if you want to read that, that would be great. But until then, peace out.